As we take a look at the book of Jude and we notice some individual lessons since we've already given the outline to the book, I want to talk about verses 3 and 4 this morning. They deal with the matter of contending for the faith. And we want to outline them and talk about it for just a few minutes. This, of course, is a very needed message today. It was needed in Jude's day. That's why Jude changed the writing. He wanted to write to them concerning the common salvation, but there was something more pressing, more needful. And Jude, as a gospel preacher, would preach the word in season and out of season. And it was the time for preaching this message. And so he wrote this letter to them. And it's a letter that is as needed today as it was then. We face the same kind of battles that he faced in the first century. As we talk about this matter of contending, we want to begin by noticing the manner in which we are to contend. The manner in which we are to contend. Notice that he says that we are to earnestly contend for the faith once delivered. Earnestly contend. You know, the manner in which we do something is extremely important. God, in teaching on the subject of worship, said that worship is to be in spirit and in truth. Now, truth has to do with the matter of authority, and it has to do with the acts, and that there is authority for the acts that we do in worship. But in spirit has to do with the attitude. And certainly that has to do with the manner in which we worship. It has to do with the action that we undertake and the heart that precedes that action. And so when we talk about contending for the faith and earnestly contending, we understand the importance of the manner that is being stressed right here. It is not just merely going through the motions of defending the faith. I'm convinced that some do that. Some will offer an objection to things that are wrong, but it's a very mild objection. And they'll speak up, and when they're not heard or not given the audience that they ought to be given, they'll just be quiet and they'll just go along with it. That's not what Jude's talking about right here. When Jude talks about earnestly contending, he's talking about being in the fight. And he's talking about being in the fight until the fight is done. He's talking about a life and death type of struggle. He isn't talking about merely voicing an objection and then moving on and going about your way. No, he's talking about something far more involved than that. And we want to make sure that this is the way that we contend for the faith. Let me try to illustrate this for you. 1 Corinthians chapter 9, in verses 24 and 25, Paul's talking about the Olympic Games, the Isthmian Games that were held at Corinth. But as he talks about these games, he talks about the way that they were to compete, or individuals competed in these games, and he used it as an illustration of the way that we are to behave ourselves in the Christian race and the type of effort that we're supposed to give. In 1 Corinthians chapter 9, beginning in verse 24, "Know ye not that they which run in a race run all, but one receiveth the prize? So run that you may obtain." Now there were a number of people that were in this race, but there's only one person that was going to win the race. And so the person that was going to win the race was going to have to put forth a great deal more effort than the others did. He was going to have to give his all because they were giving their all. If he wanted to win, that's the type of effort that it would require from him. He could not merely give a half-hearted effort and win. He could not jog while they were running. He had to put forth the kind of effort required to win. Notice in verse 25, "And every man that striveth for the mastery is temperate in all things. Now they do it to obtain a corruptible crown, but we an incorruptible." Here is the striving that's involved in this. This is the exertion that's involved in running this race. And it's giving every ounce of energy, every ounce of effort that you have. Now, there were several games that were involved in their Olympics. The marathon, the long distance running was involved in that. The wrestling was involved in that. A type of boxing was involved in that. Those were all events that took place. Well, if you think about the idea of individuals that are running to see who's going to cross the finish line first, and you think about individuals stretching to touch the tape first, to cross the line first, that's the type of effort that's being talked about when we're told to earnestly contend for the faith. That's the kind of stretching that is to be done on our part in defending the truth. Now think about the matter of wrestling. Have you ever had to wrestle? Some of you in school perhaps had to wrestle. I remember the high school I went to was just a country high school. It was a 4A school in Alabama, not a big school. But we had a coach that was hired, and he was a big guy. I don't know how much he could bench or whatever, but he was a big guy. And he expected us to do whatever he did, which, of course, we were just scrawny teenagers, and we weren't able to do that. But it didn't keep him from trying to make us do it. And so he worked us really hard, and he liked wrestling. And so when he came to the school that I went to, he introduced wrestling to us. You didn't have to be on the wrestling team, but if you were in PE, you had to wrestle. And so I was introduced to what it was to wrestle. And it was not a lot of fun, to be honest with you. One person got down on all fours, and then the other person, the match would start, and they would try to pin you. And you would try to keep from being pinned if you were the one that was down. And it was a struggle. It was a struggle. Now, there were some times when you knew it was a given. You were going to get pinned. The guy that you were against was a whole lot bigger than you, and so you could kind of just give in and get it over with. But if he knew you were giving in and getting it over with, you had to do it again. And so you had to make it look real, even if it wasn't real. And you can imagine, because we didn't get to take showers and we didn't get to do those kinds of things, that, well, you know teenage boys. And so you know that teenage boys sometimes aren't the most hygienic people in the world. And you know that instead of taking their shorts and T-shirts home every week and washing them and doing whatever, they don't always do that. And so they would play basketball as hard as they could for an hour, and then they would go stick them in their baskets. And the next day they'd get them out of their baskets, probably still wet from the day before, and they'd do that again, and they'd do that for a week, and sometimes 2 weeks or whatever. And so sometimes when you're wrestling somebody, that's who you're wrestling. And so it wasn't a great deal of fun, but I learned something about struggling with an individual. Hand-to-hand type of struggling to see who was going to win, to see who was going to be victorious in that. That's the kind of effort that's being talked about right here, is this hand-to-hand type of effort. So many of our battles today, at least initially, are fought from a great distance. They're not fought hand-to-hand. Eventually it comes to that. Every war comes to that. Our soldiers are on the ground over in Iraq today. They're still fighting a hand-to-hand kind of battle. That's not the way it started. But that's the way all battles eventually will end up, and that's how they'll eventually be decided. And so that's the kind of struggle that we're talking about right here. Notice as well in Luke 22, verse 44, another illustration of this. Surely one of these illustrations will kind of get across the type of effort that's involved in this. This is Jesus as Jesus praying in the garden. And these are the words that Luke uses. Now you know that Luke is a physician. And so Luke knows something about the human condition. He knows something about the stress that's involved in certain situations. He knows the effect that it has on the body. And so he's describing this in terms that a doctor would. It says in Luke 22 and verse 44, and being in an agony, he prayed more earnestly. And his sweat was, as it were, great drops of blood falling down to the ground. Notice being in an agony. This is an agonizing type of situation. This is this soul-wrenching type of situation that's going on here. He prayed more earnestly. This is not just your average run-of-the-mill prayer. This is not just something that's been memorized and you're going through the motions and there's really little thought or little feeling or little effort being put into it. It's not, now I lay me down to sleep and just rolling it off. It's not that type of a prayer that's being done here. It's a prayer that involves his whole being, that involves his mind. It involves everything about him is poured into this prayer. He's being poured out in prayer. There's the idea of this passage. And again, we have this idea of earnestly, the same type of contending that we are supposed to do in Jude verse 3. If you go down to the context, notice verse 56, we'll have another illustration of it. And this is the maid that is examining Peter. And Peter, of course, is gathered around the fire and says in verse 56, but a certain maid beheld him as he sat by the fire, and earnestly looked upon him, and said, This man was also with him. Now here's Peter. He's sitting around the fire, and this maid recognizes him. And she begins to earnestly behold him. And she's just not casually glancing over his way and seeing him and then moving on. No. She's staring. She's studying. She's examining to make sure. The charge that she's going to make is a pretty serious charge. He's one of them. You don't want to wrongly accuse someone of being with someone who's about to be put to death. That's where this is headed. She knows that as well as anybody. This is where this is going. He's one of them. She studies, she examines, she earnestly beholds him. There's no question in her mind who he is. That's the type of effort she put into studying him. Go to James chapter 5, verse 17. You'll see another example of this. This is another time when this is in connection with prayer, which ought to teach us something. Sometimes our prayers are cold. Sometimes our prayers are not very earnest. But he's talking about the way that we're supposed to pray there in the context. The effectual, fervent prayer of a righteous man availeth much in verse 16. Then he gives us an example of that kind of prayer in verse 17. Elias was a man subject to like passions as we are, and he prayed earnestly that it might not rain. And it rained on the earth by the space of 3 years and 6 months. He prayed, and he prayed earnestly that it might not rain. And when you picture Elijah praying for there not to be any rain upon the earth, how do you picture him praying? Earnestly, that very likely would involve fasting, going without food. It very likely would involve the weeping and the heartbreaking type of outpour that we see so often in the Old Testament. And so here is someone who likely is fasting. Here's someone who's likely weeping and who is praying. If you know anything about the condition of the nation in Elijah's day, then you know how bad it was, and you certainly know how bad Elijah thought it was. Elijah sits underneath the juniper tree, and he says, even I only am left. Elijah's praying from the perspective that he's the only one left on the earth that's faithful to God. Now we know there's still 7,000 that haven't bowed the knee to Baal. But Elijah's praying from the perspective that he's the only one that is left. Everybody else has left God, abandoned God. That's the condition that he sees the nation in. Now, if you felt like you were the only faithful Christian left on the earth, how would you be praying? Would it be just a run-of-the-mill kind of prayer? Would it be just rote memory type of situation? Or would it be literally pouring out your being to God and saying, literally, God, what are we going to do? God, your cause on the earth is down to us. What are we going to do? How is this going to proceed? How is it going to go on? And they're hunting for my life right now. And Jezebel and all of her resources are searching for me. And she's already made the promise of what she'll do if she finds me. That's the way he was praying. That's the type of earnest contending for the faith that's to be done. Ephesians 6 and verse 12 illustrates it. And it illustrates it in terms of a combat situation. Paul's talking about the Christian soldier, and he says, For we wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against principalities, against powers, against the rulers of the darkness of this world, against spiritual wickedness in the high places. We wrestle. There's this hand-to-hand struggle. And in war, this is not just to see who is victorious. This is not your typical wrestling type of match like I talked about. No, this is wrestling for life or death. There is a soldier, a retired soldier, who served. He was in Special Forces, and he worships where Alan preaches now. And it was his job, literally, to go and kill people. And obviously, that's a hard thing to live with, and it's a hard thing to deal with after the fact. and being a Christian today and being a very different person than you were in that time and that day. But I know he's described what it was like to slip up behind someone to kill them. And literally, when you make the decision to do that, you know that as soon as they feel your arm reach around them, they know what it is. And they know what it means. And they are going to exert every bit of strength and every bit of effort they have to break that hold. That's the struggle we're talking about right here. It's a struggle, literally, where someone has got you by the throat, and you've got to break the hold, or you're not going to make it. That's the contending that we're talking about. That's the earnest type of contending that we're talking about right here. In Galatians chapter 2 and verse 5, Paul talks about those who had crept in the church at Galatia, and he would say, to whom we gave subjection, no, not for an hour, that the truth of the gospel might continue with you. Here were those that Paul said, we didn't suffer it for an hour. We didn't allow them to finish what they were doing, and then in weeks to come we tried to correct it. No, that's not what we did. We dealt with it right then and right there. We didn't allow it to continue. That's earnestly contending for the faith. And Paul says that the truth of the gospel might continue with you. How long does it take for the truth of the gospel to be lost? How long does it take for error to come in and drive truth out? It doesn't take very long. Error presented one time sometimes can find its way into the hearts of people, and then it's hard to ever uproot it, ever get it out again. That's the danger that we face. We know that lukewarmness is condemned. In Revelation chapter 3 and verses 14 through 16, it's condemned of the Christian life in general, every aspect of the Christian life, but certainly it is condemned when it comes to the matter of contending for the faith. We cannot be lukewarm contenders of the faith. We have to be earnest contenders of the faith. We read of those in Revelation chapter 2 and verses 12 through 15 and also verse 20 who were tolerating some false teaching in their midst. They were having a very passive attitude toward it, and they were condemned for it because they were under the same instructions to contend earnestly for the faith. So first of all, we've seen the manner in which they were to contend, and that was earnestly. Now let's talk about the message for which they were to contend, and that is the faith. They were earnestly to contend for the faith. Now, it doesn't say that they were earnestly to contend for a faith. It doesn't say that. It doesn't even say that they were to earnestly contend for your faith. It doesn't even say that. It says that they were earnestly to contend for the faith. Now let's talk about what the faith has reference to. You know, I have found, and perhaps you have found too, that sometimes people are more willing to contend for their interpretation of something, their personal view on something, than what they are really for the truth. I guess maybe they think their personal interpretation is the truth. Maybe that's why they're contending the way that they are. But I've seen people who would fight tooth and nail for something that falls in the realm of expediency, and then would let other things that fall in a doctrinal realm go. It ought to be just the opposite of that. If it's an expedient matter, then those are matters where I can give. But if it's a doctrinal matter, those are matters in which I cannot give. In Acts chapter 6 and verse 7, Acts chapter 6 and verse 7, we read concerning the early church, and we read about a company of the priest, which is amazing in and of itself. It says in Acts 6 and verse 7, and the word of God increased, and the number of the disciples multiplied in Jerusalem greatly, and a great company of the priests were obedient to the faith. Here we're talking about the system of righteousness, the faith, that which God has revealed through the gospel. They were obedient to the gospel. They were obedient to what the gospel teaches and how the gospel says that we become righteous or just in the sight of God. That's Romans 1:16 and 17. That's what they were obedient to. Now think about who this was. This was a company of the priest. These were religious leaders. These were people whose livelihood depended upon what they did. And here were people who were walking away from that to be New Testament Christians, to be New Testament priests. They understood that. But of all the groups in the first century that would have been perhaps among the hardest to convert, we would think it would be the religious leaders of the day who had the most to lose, at least in the eyes of the people. And yet they were obedient to the faith. But we could say as well that if they were honest, and evidently they were, and they had good hearts, and evidently they did, then they were the ones who should have been able to see it the easiest, because they knew the law. And they could understand the purpose behind the law. Notice Acts chapter 13 and verse 8. Acts 13 and verse 8. Here's Elymas the sorcerer. It says, "But Elymas the sorcerer, for so is his name by interpretation, withstood them, seeking to turn away the deputy from the faith." He's trying to turn away Sergius Paulus from the faith, from this system that's been revealed. He's trying to turn him away from the gospel that was being preached and that he was to obey. Acts 14 and verse 22 says, "Confirming the souls of the disciples and exhorting them to continue in the faith, and that we must through much tribulation enter into the kingdom of God." They were to continue in the faith, continue in this system. They had obeyed the gospel. Now they were to continue in that system, following it all the way through to the very end. Acts chapter 16 and verse 5 says, "And so were the churches established in the faith and increased in number daily." It's not personal faith. We're talking about congregations collectively here. The churches were established in the faith, in this system. They were progressing in the gospel. Sometimes individuals make a lot out of the gospel is what you obey when you become a Christian, and then from there on it's doctrine. And they try to make a distinction between gospel and doctrine. But Paul is going to make very clear in Philippians 1 and verse 27, "Only let your conversation be as it becometh the gospel of Christ." Now he was writing that to Christians. And so gospel was for Christians. It wasn't just for the alien sinner, it's for Christians as well. He said, "Let your conversation be as it becometh the gospel of Christ." They were to be obedient to the gospel, yes, in obeying the plan of salvation, but in continuing to do what the gospel taught them to do. That's the faith that we're talking about right here. Go to Galatians chapter 1 and verse 23, and you'll see Paul, as Paul talks about his former life, talks about what he had done in the time before he was obedient to Christ. It says, "But they had heard only that he which persecuted us in times past now preacheth the faith which he once destroyed." He's now preaching what he once destroyed. It's described as the faith. Now go back to Acts 8 or Acts 9 and see what Paul was trying to destroy. He was trying to destroy the faith. The Bible says he was making havoc of the church. Jesus said, "Saul, Saul, why persecutest thou me?" And so he was persecuting that which Christ had revealed, that which Christ had given. He was persecuting the church that Jesus had bought. That's the faith. That's what we're talking about when we talk about the faith. Now go to 1 Corinthians 16 and verse 13. We've already noticed Romans 1, 16 and 17. I'll make a note concerning it, and that is that in the gospel, therein is the righteousness of God revealed from faith to faith. As it is written, the just shall live by faith. The righteousness is that system by which a man becomes right, by which a man is declared right. That's what that's about. 1 Corinthians 16 and verse 13 says, "Watch ye, stand fast in the faith, quit ye like men, be strong." Now, it isn't merely stand fast in your faith. It's stand fast in the faith. Now, we know that when the Bible describes faith, when it describes the faith of an individual, that it can be to a number of degrees. It can be strong, it can be weak, it can be great, it can be little. It could even be non-existent. There were those that had no faith in that sense. And so, I don't need to merely stand fast in my faith, because my faith may not be anywhere near what it needs to be. I need to stand fast in the faith. Why? Because it's perfect. It's been revealed. It's complete. My faith may not be complete. Your faith may not be complete. But this faith is complete. The gospel is complete. It doesn't need addition. It doesn't need subtraction. That's not always true of my life. It may not always be true of yours. There may be some changes that need to be made to us, but there aren't any changes that need to be made to this. And so they were to stand fast in the faith. And like I said earlier, some people are very willing to stand fast in their opinions and what they feel, what they think. They'll stand fast in that. You won't move them out of that. That's not what we need to stand fast in. What we need to stand fast in is what God has said. Stand fast in God's Word. Ephesians chapter 4. Ephesians chapter 4. And I'm spending a lot of time with this, and the reason I am is because we have to understand what we're supposed to be contending for. And the only way for us to understand what we are to be contending for is for us to understand what the faith is. And to get away from a personal kind of idea and understand the system that's being talked about. Notice in Ephesians 4 and verse 5, one Lord, one faith, one baptism. Now, what are we talking about when we talk about one faith? Well, we're talking about that one faith that comes from this one system that's been revealed. We're not contending for a faith. We're contending for the faith, the one faith, this one system that's been given to us. That's what we're contending for. Notice verse 13. Till we all come in the unity of the faith. You understand now from that what we're talking about. Now, let's look at Colossians 1:23. We'll notice a couple more and then we'll move on. Colossians 1:23. If you continue in the faith, grounded and settled, be not moved away from the hope of the gospel, which you have heard and which was preached to every creature which is under heaven, whereof I, Paul, am made a minister. Here we are to continue in the faith. Continue in this system. We start this race when we obey the gospel of Jesus Christ. But Paul talked about in 1 Corinthians 9:24 through 27, not being a castaway. We start this race, but we've got to finish this race. We've got to continue in this till we get to the end. We've got to be faithful to it to the end. And what we've got to be faithful to is that which God has revealed. Paul talked about in 1 Timothy 1 and verse 2, Timothy was his son in the faith. He was a spiritual son. Paul had converted him. He had been converted to the faith. 1 Timothy 5 and verse 8, again, has reference to the faith, as 1 Timothy 6:10 and 6:21 likewise do. So we see the manner in which we are to contend, which is earnestly. We see the message for which we are to contend, that's the faith. But now let's talk about the men with whom we are to contend, and that is with ungodly men. In Jude verse 4, Jude's going to explain there are certain men crept in unawares. There's certain men. He doesn't name them, but he clearly is going to identify them by the description that he gives. They're not figments of his imagination. He's not being an alarmist. He's not talking about something that might happen. He's talking about something that is already underway. Something that is happening. These men are already there. And we talked about last week what it would have been like to have been one of these false teachers. And there's a letter that arrives from Jude. And a brother starts to read that letter for the congregation. And Jude starts out talking about the common salvation and how he was going to write a letter about the common salvation. And probably these individuals would not have had a problem with that. Sure, talk about the common salvation. Talk about that as much as you want to. But then when Jude starts to turn and he says, I'm writing to exhort you to earnestly contend for the faith. And then when he gets to verse 4 and he says, there are certain men crept in unawares. And he begins to go. Can you imagine? You ever seen anybody squirm? You know what I'm talking about? Where they're in an audience and it gets very, very pointed. There were times when the Pharisees, in the presence of Jesus, hearing Jesus teach, what did they do? Well, squirm would probably be a pretty good word for it. They perceived that he spoke of them, we're told. They became very uncomfortable because they understood he's talking about us. Well, these false teachers, as this letter is being read, they understand Jude's talking about us. He's telling the brethren about us, and he's telling the brethren that they ought to be earnestly contending against us. We're no longer unawares. The brethren have been alerted to our presence. Now things become very, very serious for them. He describes them in verse 4 in a number of ways. He describes them as basically as thieves who have crept in unawares, who have slipped in for the purpose of robbing or stealing away something from these brethren. Do you like thieves? Are they high on your like list? Now, there are a few things in life that we detest more than a thief. We go and we work for something, we put forth effort, we give our money for it, and then they come in and they steal it, take it away from us. There are very few people that we like less than we like a thief. He identifies them as a thief. But then he continues, he says, who were before of old ordained to this condemnation. They're condemned men. Ungodly men. Turning the grace of God into lasciviousness. That's what they were doing. And denying the only Lord God and our Lord Jesus Christ. That's what they were denying. We see what they were doing. We see what they were denying. They were turning the grace of God into lasciviousness. Literally arguing that the grace of God gives us the freedom to do whatever we want to do. It gives us license to sin. We don't have to worry about sin. The grace of God will take care of that. We can live any kind of lives that we want to live. We talked about later in the context the love feast and how they were being corrupted and all of that type of thing. Peter's talking about the same thing in 2 Peter chapter 2 and verse 1. In fact, if you want commentary on this, that's inspired commentary. Peter's describing the false teachers that he's dealing with in the same way that Jude describes them here, even the way they crept in, came in unawares. Paul talked about that in Galatians 2 and verse 4. And to come in unawares, the Greek word there literally means to come in by a side door. They don't come in the front door. They don't come in. Have you ever walked into a church building that you weren't familiar with and you accidentally came in the front door? You ever done that and came right up in front of the auditorium? You wanted to come in the back, but you came in the door and suddenly you're facing the whole congregation. You came in the wrong. The false teachers aren't coming in that door. They're coming in a side door. They just come in quietly and sit down. Don't make much of a... They're like a thief coming into a house. They're not trying to make much noise. They want to settle in. They want people to get comfortable with them. They want to build relationships. They want to have opportunities one-on-one to talk to individuals about things and get individuals persuaded to their way of thinking. And then after they have 2 or 3 or 10 or 12 or 20 or whatever, a group that believes the way they do, then they'll start becoming more vocal. Or they may even allow that group to be vocal for them. That's the way they work. They don't come in the front door and instantly start declaring their false doctrines. If they did that, what would happen? They'd be dealt with very quickly. In fact, the whole group would be against them because they don't have any relationships formed. There's no one that's already been persuaded to their way of thinking, and so they're kind of standing alone. They don't do that. They know how to go about it. Romans chapter 16 and verses 17 and 18 deals with a way that we are to deal with them, and that is that we are to mark them, and we are to avoid them. They understand that's the way we're supposed to deal with them. That's why they come in quietly, and that's why they come in and build those relationships before they can be marked and before we know to avoid them. You don't know to avoid them initially until they teach these things, and then you do. But sometimes by then, it's already too late. That's why it's so important. And why we're so blessed here to have Con and Larry, and the fact that they meet with individuals who are wanting to place membership here and talk to those individuals. You might not know everything, but they try to at least find out things, find out some background, and so that we're guarded against that. Obviously, in this day and age, there are people that will come and settle in and never place membership, and they could be a threat as well, and you've got to be aware of that. Sometimes people don't place membership for that very reason, because they don't want the authority over them. They don't want anyone telling them what they can and what they can't do. But eventually, even in that situation, elders would have to deal with it. If there was someone that came in and settled down, even though they didn't place membership, and they were teaching something false, they would have to deal with it. Because that individual is harming the flock and is threatening the flock. And it's their job to deal with that. I thank you for your attention this morning.